Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Yakri here with another Dominions 5 video. So, this is the third video on blesses that I'm doing out of 4. And before we get started on astral and death magic blesses, I want to talk about heat and cold auras, because I made a fairly substantial mistake on those when I talked about them in my first video. So, for some reason, at this point, I'm like, or in hindsight, I'm not really sure how I made this mistake, because I must have known how this worked correctly at some point when I was playing Dominions 4, but I thought that heat and cold auras would only stack in area, right, between multiple units. So if you had 2 units, it would just increase the area you're covering. You still only get 5 fatigue per turn, but, of course, they actually deal separate instances of fatigue damage. So massing troops is, of course, much more effective than using, say, elite troops with these auras, at least as long as your troops don't die immediately. It pretty much it changes the power level of this bless pretty significantly. I think, like, before I rated it rather low, and I think I'd rate it much more highly with this in consideration. In particular, it's very good on sacreds that you can get a lot of, like size 2 units that are fairly cheap, preferably available off capital, and that you can mass, right? And the reason being for size 2 being you can have more units per square, so you can get more ticks of fatigue per turn in enemy units, right? A lot of the things I said in my first video still apply. Like, it's still most effective versus elite enemy units that you couldn't just mow down with your sacreds anyway. It's still more effective on sacreds that are tough, but I might say that since you can mass them, it's most effective on something like flagellants, right, that are a really weak unit, but you can get a bunch of them very cheaply, and they're only size 2. However, it's not very effective on flagellants just on its own like that. You need to do something additional to them to make them durable enough to actually have a significant impact with this bless, such as giving them Stygian flesh, or Stygian flesh or Stygian skin. Stygian flesh, or some other buff to their durability. Same goes for a lot of other unit types. Although there are certainly some sacreds out there that are very tough to begin with, and only have, say, a single attack, in which case this might be more viable. Chill aura is also probably more effective generally than heat aura, in my opinion. Setting people on fire is great, but stopping them from attacking you with freeze is better, because of course, if you set someone on fire, they don't stop attacking you until they're dead, whereas if you freeze someone, when that effect happens, you immediately stop them from attacking you. So it makes your units more survivable, and of course, the longer they spend not killing your units, the closer they come to all fatiguing out and passing out and being murdered by your units very easily, right? So, and it's also not very effective against chaff, of course, because if you can kill them easily, they're going to die before they're significantly impacted by the fatigue, and because the skill penalties, like the penalties to attack and defense, and the fact that going over 15 fatigue halves the usefulness of your armor, is not very relevant on units that don't have armor, that don't have very good attack stats, right? Combat stats. So it's much more effective against units that are elite units that you would have trouble killing without the auras, and so on and so forth. It's also relatively easy to counter, like compared to, say, strength, right? Strength bless, you could say, like, oh, well, your opponent could cast spells like, you know, mass protection to raise the base protection of his units, making his units take less damage. He could cast late in the game Army of Lead and so on. He could cast all these things to make his units more durable against regular attacks. That's true. However, keep in mind that anything your opponent could cast to make their units more resistant to regular attacks would still be useful if you had no bless, and it will be less useful because you have the strength bless, right? That increases your damage. Although there are sometimes better tools for the job, like flaming weapons, of course. If someone casts mist form, is much more useful than simply dealing more damage per hit, particularly if your more damage per hit isn't high enough to occasionally break the mist form, right? Okay, so I think that pretty much covers it. Basically, I rated it too lowly, although I was mostly correct about the when heat aura and chill aura are actually good. I just didn't rate its power level correctly, because for some reason I thought it was only like, it wouldn't stack with multiple units. Also, I checked in game, and Heat and Cold Chill Aura do stack if you get both blesses. However, keep in mind that they grow stronger and weaker in their respective climates or in their opposed climates. So Heat Aura in Cold 3 is not very effective, whereas Heat Aura in Heat 3 is very effective, right? So keep that in mind. Now, with that out of the way, I want to start on all of the fun blesses in Astral and Death Magic. And so we're going to get into some more of the more interesting utility blesses here. So magic resistance is a little bit different from the other resistances in that instead of giving you damage reduction against an element type, it gives you a chance to negate certain spells that have a magic resistance check component on them, right? That's kind of a topic for another day, but suffice it to say it's particularly good for units that can be targeted by additional effects of this type, or if you expect to fight a nation like Kaelasa or some other nation that has heavy access to astral magic. Because astral magic has a lot of spells with magic resistance checks, which is why magic resistance is available in astral magic, right? It's like the providence of astral magic. So, in particular, that means animals and magic creatures and demons and undead benefit the most from magic resistance. Let's see. Arcane Command is like a handy utility ability that can be useful for certain nations like Kaelasa that need to lead around magical troops and get poor magic leadership to do it with. Spirit Sight, this negates certain things. Yes, invisible units and lets you fight in the dark without penalties. This is really niche, right? Fighting in the dark is very uncommon. Invisible units are quite uncommon as well. So, not super useful. I want to say Spirit Sight can do something it isn't listed as being able to do. Maybe I'll check and get back to you in another video, like negate Glamour. I want to say I saw someone post about that, but I don't know if that's actually true or if someone just said that without having any idea what it did. So unless that's the case, I would say this is pretty useless for the most part, especially for 2 points. Like, very odd, right? Like, you don't fight in the darkness very often without like very powerful late game magic. And there's very few invisible units in the game, so you're gonna have a hard time making use of it. Magic weapons is really nice because it negates a lot of things, right? It will negate etherealness, which is later down here in arcane magic, and it's going to negate things like mist form. It's going to negate what's that one called? Stygian flesh that I was just talking about, and there are some other things it gets around. I believe. Let's rephrase this. I haven't tested it because I was surprised by this, so I'm not 100% sure it's true since I haven't tested it myself. But I believe someone said that I saw someone say that magic weapons don't count as blunt, piercing, or slashing weapons, right? They count as magic weapons, meaning that fortitude would be negated by having magic weapons on your sacreds. So it's a counter, right? It's very definitely a counter to certain things. And so you should use it if you expect to have problems with those things and not otherwise. Well, how to expect that is perhaps a more difficult topic to go into. I don't want to include it in this video, I don't think. But essentially knowing what other nations can do and what you can do with spells will give you some context of whether or not you're going to expect this to be a problem. And to some extent, it's kind of a metagame of reading your opponents and knowing what you think they'll, or having a good idea of what they might do. But it's kind of tough to use. Keep in mind that the benefits of magic weapon are applied by other things like flaming weapons and stuff. So it's mainly if you're like not taking flaming weapons or anything, you're just boosting your damage with strength, and you want to make sure that people can't counter you with by casting a ethereal body or mist form or something. You take magic weapons to counter that counter, right? Solar weapons are kind of handy. 3 AP damage is not going to affect units aside from undead very often. Its bonus against undead is huge. Perhaps if you were playing in a middle-age game against both Middle Airmore and Asphodel, this would be a good option, right? Because then you have an expectation of a lot of undead being on the table, and potentially other people could try and make use of undead as well. If there are any death nations besides those on the field, like Middle Catis, they could cast Horde of Skeletons a lot, and this would be handy against them. The 3 AP damage will be mostly useless, but versus weaker like chaff units and stuff, it will affect them as well, so that's handy. And of course, because it is magic, a magical form of attack, you can use it to dispel mist form and stuff like that. So it's kind of handy, like a little bit more of an expensive option than magic weapons. Overall, I don't like it, except for the fact that you can kind of pick it up as certain nations while you're splashing for magic paths, and it's not an incarnate bless, so you can have this in a dormant or imprisoned pretender as sort of a handy bonus, right? Okay, so Farcaster is really good, and it's particularly good at sort of saving you from yourself, right? From bad luck or poor scripting, because when mages can't reach a target with the spell you've told them to cast, they'll just do something else on their own. Sometimes it'll be very inoffensive, like buffing themselves. Sometimes it'll be really, really stupid, like casting a high fatigue cost spell when they need to cast something else next that's also high fatigue cost and more important. So yeah, it'll help you land your intended spells more often, right? And it will also allow you to do things that you simply couldn't do otherwise, like spam spells that you would not be able to reach the enemy's like back half of their battlefield with otherwise. And some spells, like the real good point is range 20 spells, right? Because range 20 spells will be increased to range 30, and that's a pretty sizable increase, right? I mean, 50% is always 50%, right? Quite a large bonus, but 10 additional squares farther reach makes all the difference between being able to put your casters behind your like really large troop lines in a late game battle and have them actually be able to reach the front enemy lines with a range 30 spell. Versus not being able to with the range 20 spell, potentially, right? Or you having to put your casters so far up that they're in danger when you would prefer them not to be, of course. And with range 30 spells, naturally they go to range 45, which is very long and gives you much more leeway to keep your casters safely at the back of the battlefield, right? So it's a little situational, depending on the kind of spells that you need to cast. For example, it's a lot less useful on Kaelasa because they're going to cast a lot of Mind Burn and Soul Slay, which have like range 99 or range 100 or something. Maybe it's range 50, I forget, but it's like across the whole battlefield pretty much. And so this is going to be a little bit superfluous, right, on those casters. I think that pretty much covers that. Oh yeah, buffs. Buffs tend to have range 10. Extending that to range 15 can maybe let you get an extra cast of a buff spell off on units that are moving forward to attack. It kind of depends on the speed of the units, but it gives you some protection against your buffs missing and your mages spending turns like just buffing each other or something when you don't want them to. Arcane Finesse. This is, the kind of the reverse of major magic resistance and minor magic resistance. It will give your mages a better chance to penetrate enemy magic resistance, so it's really useful if you're going to be spamming spells like Mind Burn or Soul Slay. So for example, squeezing this in on Kaelasa, or a nation like, not that nation, or a nation like Bandarlog would be very handy. A lot of the nations that can make the most use of it have a hard time fitting it on their nation, in my opinion, but there's certainly going to be cases where you can fit this into your build and get some advantage for it. And essentially, it just means that more spells are going to go through, and when you're spamming a spell like Soul Slay that instantly kills units, more spells going through equates directly to an increased percentage of enemy units killed, right, per cast. So you get more effectiveness out of your mages directly from this if you're casting those spells all the time. Twist Fate negates the first attack against a unit. In particular, this negates many types of spells, right? And the really handy thing about this is if your sacreds get hit by something like, I think there's a cap on the damage. It might not negate Soul Slay. I'm not sure. I think it doesn't. It might be luck I'm thinking of. There's certain things that negate death or negate attacks that don't versus certain other attacks. It's a little bit finicky. But for the most part, this will negate things like Gifts from Heaven, abilities that should instantly kill your sacreds and will let them survive just a tiny bit longer so that they can actually be effective, right? And it's one of the few things you can do to counter spell casting on your sacreds. But mostly, I don't think it's very good. It's just that it has a definitive niche that nothing else really fills. But I'm not a fan of it overall. It's just a little too expensive to just negate one attack, because you could just be negating an arrow that might not have hurt your unit anyway, right? Assuming you have well-armored units. Fate Weaving, I think this curses enemy units. for the next round of battle, unless I'm completely wrong about what this does, which I suppose is possible. This is garbage. Like, this is misfortune. It says, their fate will be rewritten and will suffer from misfortunes. Unless misfortunes is like -10 to all stats, I'm not a fan of this. Especially since you have to be anyone striking the units. They have to hit you, I think, for this to activate. I haven't experimented with it. Maybe I should, and I'll issue a correction if I'm wrong next video. But I'm pretty sure this is garbage, right? I haven't seen anyone else mention it as being good, and I don't see any way it would be unless it does something very unexpected. But I bet you this just curses people temporarily, and it's just, or something similar. Fate rewritten and suffer misfortunes. Like, this is almost like worse than Fire Shield, right? Because it doesn't say it's gonna like damage someone. It doesn't say it's gonna kill them, right? Like I want to. It's not even damage reflection, right? I want something to really. If it has to be on hit for like 7 points. I expect it to fuck them up, right? Like, that's my expectation for something that requires an enemy to hit you, right? It needs to be good. Luck, similarly, 8 astral points. Luck scales in your dominion. 75% to avoid fatal blows. So this is kind of better than it sounds. Like, I'm not a fan of this, but at the same time, I don't want to be too harsh on it out of bias because, like, think of it this way, right? So an enemy attacks you 4 times, and they can one-shot you each time. Well, only one of those, on average, right? This is like exactly how luck works. They could hit you 8 times in a row, and it doesn't do anything. Only one of those times, though, in theory, will actually hurt you. So this is quite good, right, to just avoid fatal blows, because, like I mentioned before, if someone casts Gifts from Heaven, which does like 200 damage or something, and it falls on your square, you could just, whoops, I dodged it. Just straight up negate it. No dice. And if your units are like tiny 10 HP units, this is a lot more value because maybe they're being hit over the head by giants, right? Like if your units are 0 protection 10 HP units, they can pretty much survive about 1, maybe 2 hits. This increases that to maybe 4 or 5 hits before they die on average. Of course, they can be unlucky and just die immediately. It's still an option, but it can potentially, on average, it makes your units 4 times tougher when you think of it that way. The thing is that on very elite units, like if you put this on giants, for example, well, they can survive a lot of hits before they go down. And then just on the last hit, did they get a little bit of extra toughness, right? Whereas you could take a ability like, I don't know about how many giants actually have. Yeah, let's do hard skin. That's a good one because a lot of giants will have better than human base protection. Hard skin's a good one. You improve their protection, you give them more damage resistance, and so when they're already taking like 10 attacks, like 5 damage reduction across 10 attacks is a lot of damage reduced, and they can probably survive like 14 or 15 or 16 attacks, and it's a good chance that if you combine it with something else that will grow in excess of like what it would linearly add, right? So I mean, I don't want to say multiplicatively, because that's not really correct terminology, but the effects will compound, right? Combining hard skin and regeneration will have a greater effect than if you added together what regeneration or hard skin alone would give you, right? They're greater than the sum of their parts when you put those things together, and that's why multiple blesses of like a type that increase the unit's toughness can be very good. So for that reason, not a huge fan of it, but I don't know. I think I would rate this fairly lowly, but I think at the same time there's a distinct possibility that someone could surprise me with a good strategy or a particular unit I hadn't thought of where luck is very good on that unit when maybe combined with something else. I don't know. It could be quite handy. It's still very expensive, right? But I think on very weak units that can die super easily, luck may enhance their durability more than almost anything else, right? Rather a surprising amount, and I think there's very few things that can counter it. Like, for example, etherealness. This is something that I would say it's a very powerful ability that's probably bad, because this is the cost of taking 3 magic scales. Now, maybe you're playing a nation where you'd like to take 3 magic scales anyway, but that's not very many nations. Even the nations that can benefit might not want to invest 3 points in it. Excuse me. So this is kind of a big ask, right? 10 astral bless points. That's just a huge investment overall to have all these positive scales, right? Especially because a lot of blessed nations do want to take drain instead, just because they have so few options for scales they could knock down a peg, right? At this point. So, and the thing is that ethereal is completely countered by magic weapons, right? If your units you're fighting against have magic weapons, this doesn't do anything at all, right? It does nothing. It's completely worthless versus magic weapons. Now, versus mundane weapons, you only get hit 75% of the time. So it's kind of like luck, except it's much better because even on the first hit, even if it wouldn't kill you normally, right? You can still negate it 75% of the time. It's good versus archers. It's good versus units in melee. It's good in most situations. It's good versus many spells that deal physical damage, like Blade Wind, as is mentioned in the spell's description. The thing is that Flaming Arrows is a very common spell because it's super good, and that counters this. The magic weapons Bless at 2 points counters this. There are units that naturally have magic weapons, which counters this. There are many other types of magic weapons buffs, like flaming weapons, that counter this. It's so... I feel like... I don't know if you could really make it cheap, right? Otherwise, everyone would use it all the time, maybe even just for expansion if this was cheap. But it's countered so easily that I would be very wary of bringing this out against human opponents, because there's a good chance they might just annihilate my sacreds. And if you're investing this heavily in your sacreds, they really should do a lot for you, right? So I'm not sure this is super viable. Perhaps there's cases where it would be a little more of a good option, especially if you know that you're not going to be facing anyone who naturally has magical weapons. They might have to go out of their way to get magic weapons. Or if you're facing, say, no blessed nations, right? No nations with any sacreds of note. Well, perhaps you expect that even if they can hit you through etherealness, their sacreds will be so garbage that you'll just run them over anyway. So that could be one option. And what you really have to worry about is their regular troops, in which case, as long as their regular troops don't have magic weapons, you're good to go. You may want to make sure you have a way to counter flaming arrows, because I can see that being a distinct problem, but it could be good then, maybe. It's still very expensive, so I'm a little unsure about it. Compared to some other like durability options, I think when you just take a glance at it, right, protection is much better than you think it might be, right? Because there's a lot of ways, it depends a little bit on your sacred, to add between 5 and 10 damage reduction on a given hit that your unit receives. And that actually comes pretty close in a lot of cases to negating 75% of attacks. Of course, there's the point that etherealness would work if you're facing giants or other very high damage sacreds, as long as they don't have magic weapons, right? Like all manner of berserkers, jaguar warriors, things like Vanheers, I think. Pretty sure they don't have magic weapons. I think they just have axes. And those sorts of things that would maybe do like 27, 30 damage or something, right? With maybe a bless increasing their strength, like Blood Surge. Well, etherealness will work quite well versus them, whereas hard skin might not work so well unless your units have obscenely high protection to begin with, right? So, something to keep in mind. They all have their trade-offs. It's just the cost is so incredibly high, even compared to like hard skin at 6 Earth Bless points. It's got nothing on 10 Astral and 3 Magic scales. Yeah. So I'm a little undecided on etherealness. Both luck and etherealness I think are a little iffy, but I think overall I'm not a big fan of them compared to other options. Mostly etherealness, of course, just because it's very good. Almost regardless of the circumstances, it's just so... The counters are so prevalent. If you get shut down really hard. Okay, moving on. Undying. So this is really good bang for your buck. Keep in mind that this is not super useful if your concern is buffing mages. And it's not super useful if your concern is super elite units. And that's because your units, if they go down to negative hit points, this allows them to basically go below 0 hit points and not die yet. But they do die after the battle, right? So it's still useful. But this is like a second-rate option that you wish you didn't have to pick on a lot of nations, because if you have super elite units, you want them to survive the battle. You want to take blesses that improve their odds of surviving the battle because it makes them more efficient, right? It gives you more bang for your buck. It gives you more bang for like the amount of units you can conceivably recruit per turn. This is especially true if you have only on capital sacreds. It gives you more benefit out of all the forts you have recruiting sacreds. If you do have multiple forts recruiting them, it gives you more benefit out of your gold that you spend on them, and so on and so forth, right? And it's just overall better economy. So, and of course on mages or thugs, you're losing a huge amount if they go down to negative hit points and then die. after the battle, right? Because you expect them to survive multiple battles, or at least you really want them to make them worth it, right? Losing those really hurts. So this is not super useful for those types of units. It's useful for like large amounts of chaff units, right? Those are the kind of units where you probably expect them to die regardless, right? And so giving them a little bit more durability, they survive maybe one more hit before they die, well worth it. Doesn't really matter if they die after the battle, you'll just print more of them, right? So that's what that's good for. Undead Command, probably not good for a lot of nations, right? You probably have better things to spend the points on, especially if you have Undead Command. You might have Undead Sacreds, and maybe you could spend your points on Undying, because its downside does not happen if your unit is undead. It just gets to survive, so that's fine. Only plus 20 to Undead Command. The real issue I have with Undead Command compared to like Magic, what's it called? Arcane Command. Arcane Command is only plus 10, I believe, right? But I would say it's like 4 times more useful than Undead Command, because you generally, if you're leading undead troops, you're leading a lot of them. There are not like any nations I can think of that have a small core of elite undead that they realistically like actually want to use. I think was it Middle Ulm has Ghoul, or is it Late Ulm? One of the ages of Ulm, middle or late, I forget, has Ghoul Guardians, right? And they're undead. They're not sacreds, right? Yeah, it's like these other guys that are sacreds. They're not sacreds. They're just undead, and they're super elite. And you have a hard time leading them. So that'd be a good time to have Undead Command. Except that you never recruit those guys anyway, because they're like super elite anti-sacreds that are just kind of awkward to use, and you'd rather just bombard the enemy sacreds with spells anyway. But you might use them sometimes, but it's not worth spending a bless point in Death Magic for, probably. You don't have... anyway. Point is that just plus 20 undead leadership is a little lackluster, considering that in almost all cases you'll be leading hordes of undead, hundreds and hundreds of units. So adding plus 20 or spending 2 points and adding plus 40 is not like a real killer payout. If it was plus 40 per point, maybe I would change my mind, but I'd rather just take some Undying if you can get any use out of it at all. Half Dead, this is probably not that useful. Seldom affected by diseases. It's not the same as immune to diseases, which is what I'd like to see. But it's probably okay. Primarily for keeping your old mages from becoming diseased, but it's hard to... There's not a lot of nations that would take death scales anyway, like maybe Abyssia? Maybe? But if for whatever reason you're like splashing 4 points in death and you don't need Stygian flesh for any reason, maybe, and you have death scales also, alright, sure, why not, right? Seldom affected by diseases is kind of nice. Not requiring, not requiring anything to eat is not very useful though. Especially when it's only on your sacreds. If it was your whole army, somehow, maybe. But not only on your sacreds, it's not super great for the most part. There are cases where this is useful, don't get me wrong, but you need to have a huge number of units massed for that to be the case. And when this only helps your sacreds, it's kind of iffy. I'm not a big fan of this at all. But like I said, mages could potentially benefit from the disease resistance. So withering weapons is kind of interesting. If we had like multiple nations with decent sacred archers, or like a nation with recruit anywhere sacred archers, this might be a lot more interesting to have. It's a very good ability. Battles really have to drag on for a long time for this to be useful, but it has amazing attrition even if you lose a battle, because if the enemy units are not like elves or something, this causes units to age rapidly and die, which means that human units will probably die of old age after the battle. And if you can indiscriminately hit enemy units with this, it's very good in terms of how many units they'll lose after the battle's over, right? So it'll give them, how to put it, it'll deal a lot of extra damage to them in terms of their overall economy and how the war's going. So if you could really spread this around, I'd be a huge fan of it. There's also the fact that it's not incarnate only, right? So you could take it as like kind of a side benefit, right? And some sort of rainbow bless. So I would definitely consider it with some nations. Just keep in mind that it's kind of weak, and it's kind of the thing where like it won't actually help you during the battle usually. I think it's possible for it to, right? Because they age per round of combat, but it would have to be a really long battle and versus human units for it to have a significant impact. or units that are already kind of old. Okay, so, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think there are very many Sacreds that have, like, the right kind of loadout, you know, like, kind of weapons and stat line to make good use of this. Archers would be, like, my ideal, but there are very few Sacred Archers in the game. Okay, Stygian Flesh. This is an all-star kind of bless. I think it's very, very good on a lot of nations. Primarily any time where your Sacreds have less than 5 protection. This is a pretty good pickup. Hopefully you want like 0, 1, 2, 3, and yes, I believe there are a couple. I think it's like I think it's like the Long Dead Horsemen of Middle Airmore that actually have 0 protection and are sacred. So Invulnerability gives you a 10 natural protection against non-magical weapons. It's effectively setting your natural protection to 10, right? It doesn't stack with other bonuses to natural protection. It overwrites your natural protection and sets it to 10. So you can't take this and Bark Skin and really get much of a benefit. You can't take this when you already have 10 natural protection. It doesn't stack with spells that boost your natural protection up instead. But it's very good, right? Especially if your unit has low natural protection and good armor, right? Because if you have a unit with like 2 natural protection and 14 armor, right? Or 14 protection from armor. Well, maybe let's say 12 protection from armor for like 14 total. And you take this is boosting their protection by 8. Now there's that fall off on protection that I keep forgetting to look up what the exact fall off on it is, but it's going to come close to giving them 20 protection, right? So it's very, very good for you overall. And for units like Kael'thasa, where they have like actually no protection, like 1 or 2 protection and no armor at all, it can be absolutely like essential, right? Because you're taking their damage reduction and increasing it by like 10 times effectively, like their total damage reduction that they have available to them. And a lot of units like that tend to have other strong benefits. Either they're free spawn, or they're really cheap, or they're wearing good armor, or they have some special ability like Awe that makes them more durable. And so just giving them this baseline durability, which is 10, is kind of like the standard like light infantry durability, or like maybe medium infantry is more accurate. Light infantry is closer to like 7 protection, but and it's very handy, right? It adds a huge amount to their survivability all at once. And so on many Sacreds that have this sort of setup where they're kind of low defense, high offense, this is a huge force multiplier, right? It's really beneficial. We're going to talk about Bark Skin later. Does basically the same thing with different weaknesses. So this is the weakness is the same as etherealness, right? Same deal, right? Everything that counters ethereal counters Stygian Flesh. Now, why do I think a Stygian Flesh is way better? Well, it costs 5 death points, has no scales point requirements, whereas this costs 10 astral points and has 3 scales point requirements, right? So even though this is a less powerful effect and has the same counters, effectively, I think it's much stronger than etherealness in most games, right? People are going to consider it less of a priority to actively counter this, because they could counter it just with weight of troops, because it's not quite so overwhelmingly powerful as etherealness. And, yeah, it's going to cost you less of an investment to get it, so when you lose it, it won't hurt as much, right? That's the idea anyway. Still, I'm probably going to eventually recommend Barkskin a little bit over Stygian Flesh. However, sometimes it's a better choice to take Stygian Flesh because you want the death pathing, or because you have easy access to the death pathing on the pretenders that your nation gets access to. In particular, a lot of people get access to the Demi-Lich, who is super, super efficient for picking up some death blesses along with some other bless paths, right? Because he gets low path cost and has decent Dominion score. Okay, so now the rest of these are a little less exciting in my opinion because they're kind of weird or overcosted. Reanimators is very fun though. It's, what is it, 7 death bless points. It's probably overpriced because when your blessed units kill someone, right, it can raise the person that they kill as a soulless undead. And the soulless undead will fight for you. But here's the issue. It's a 50% chance. It's not 100% of the time. That's a big problem already. I don't know, it just doesn't quite feel like it gets you enough units. Even if you like wipe out a lot of enemies in a charge, you get like 1 or 2 guys out of it, which is just, a little underwhelming, right? So for that reason, I'm not really a huge fan of it to begin with. And then there's the fact that the soulless are kind of weak, right? Soulless Undead are like terrible chaff units. And so sometimes you get one of them. You don't get them all at once, and then it just kind of like gets one shot usually without doing anything. Alright, maybe it's made a distraction. It's taken one attack that might have been meant for another of your units. That's kind of handy. So, but it's not very impactful. My gut feeling after... I have tested this one actually quite a bit because I thought it was cool. But my gut feeling is that this is terrible, and we won't see anyone making good use out of it. Still, I'd love for someone to prove me wrong. I'll probably try it in a multiplayer game eventually, just for kicks. We'll see how that goes. The real neat thing about this is that your sacred mages can kill people with spells, and it will raise them as soulless, potentially. Now, that is kind of cool. If you cast some... I think like Earthquake would probably work. Like if you cast Earthquake, or in fact, if you're one of the most closest to viable suggestions I've seen, is that you would cast a spell like Bone Grinding, right? Over and over again with a Lich. Or like maybe the Master Lich, or maybe you've summoned a Lich, and you just cast Bone Grinding a couple times and kill a bunch of chaff units against a nation like Middle Pangea, right? Where they have a bunch of Maenads. And you could cast, what's some other spell that probably any spell the undead doesn't care about that would still count as your mage killing those units, right? Like various poison spells potentially. So anything that undead don't care about, so you don't friendly fire your own dudes and has a wide AoE, and suddenly you're maybe getting some pretty good value out of this by creating this sort of battlefield where the enemy's troops are crippled and they can't fight in these effects you're throwing down, and your undead that are raising up are pretty effective. What I'd really like to see is some changes to the code, because I'm pretty sure things like the battlefield enchantment Foul Vapors, right? I'm like 80% sure that will not reanimate people, right? It counts as your mage like indirectly killing them, so this won't have an effect. I would love to see a change from the developers so that does raise people as undead, because then this could maybe be a much more viable combo, because I think some of the best spells theoretically to go with this don't work with it at all, which is one of the biggest drawbacks. So anyway, if you want to play some single player games versus the AI with this, highly recommend it. It's kind of hilarious. Maybe you can find some good battlefield nuking spells that'll have a good effect with this. So yeah, for that reason, it's kind of fun. One also side note is that this is pretty good at disrupting enemy formations, right? They'll get distracted attacking these random undead inside of their lines if you kill them with mage spells, right? Spells from your sacred mages. So that has a little bit of extra value added to it. Now, Reforming Flesh. This is literally just regeneration for undead. That's what it is. I've seen some people mark this as... I saw a guide where someone marked this as like terrible or useless or something. That just seems kind of weird to me. It is useless if you're not an undead nation, but if you're playing Middle Air more, it's useful, and regeneration is useless. It's niche, right? You just have absolutely no use for it if you're playing Mictlan, for example. But if you're playing Middle Air more, you do. Or if you're playing Nazca, you might, right? So it's kind of a weird spell. It's just they separated regeneration into these Reforming Flesh and regeneration, basically to give undead nations a little bit of a harder time, because Middle Airmore is kind of OP. So that's why it exists, and that's what it does. Pretty much. If you want regeneration as an undead nation, you take this. Death weapons. Death weapons are interesting. It's 2 armor negating damage that diseases the target. This has kind of a similar effect to withering weapons, right? Which is that the units are going to lose HP slowly over time and die. It's really nice to use against enemy sacred troops. It's really nice to use against enemy thugs. Any units that you maybe couldn't kill, that your opponent is going to be really sorry to lose. The thing is that each attack can, let's see, the attack and the disease effect can be negated by magic resistance. The checks are made independently, which is kind of nice at least, so better odds of something affecting the unit. Overall, I think death weapons are a little weak. They're kind of on the expensive side at 8 death points, right? Like flaming weapons are cheaper, I believe. I think they're 6. And they don't have, I mean, you can negate them with fire resistance, but they don't have this like built-in ability that all units can potentially just ignore this effect, right? So they're a little bit niche. I'm trying to think of when I would really want this. I guess this would be good versus heavily armored targets. However, now we have thunder weapons, and I think let me double check what those did. Thunder weapons. This is what Air 7, right? Air 7 1 armor negating damage. So 2 armor negating damage uncapped, which I assume it means it can roll. So it can actually roll higher than 2, and whatever it rolls, it's ignoring. It doesn't have to roll against protection, so it means you're going to have 2 plus 2d6 damage all the time, right? Well, since it can be negated by magic resist sometimes, I would say this is actually, it's pretty okay, right? It sort of depends on what you're dealing with. There are some nations, mostly astral nations, because they can easily cast anti-magic, right, which raises the magic resistance of all units on the battlefield. Those are going to be a problem for you. And of course, the elite units that you'd most like to use this against are going to often have higher magic resistance. That's going to be a problem for you. Overall, I think this is actually pretty good. And the reason, in large part, is actually because Death Blesses are cheaper than almost any other bless you can get. And it's entirely because of the Master Lich and the Demi Lich. The Demi Lich especially is available to a lot of nations, and he's just super cheap. He is so cheap. And he's immobile, which is unfortunate, but he's got like a decent amount of combination of having like 3-in-1 magic path, death, cheap path cost for other magic paths, and decent dominion score, right? AKA not 1. And so he's almost like a kind of a superior, whatchamacallit, mage pretender, right? Rainbow pretender. And the thing is that he's also immortal, which is rarely useful, but being immortal and undead means that, for one, if you splash him into astral magic or air magic, you can then teleport him places, and he'll die and then come back 3 months later. For another, it means that he isn't going to get diseased unexpectedly and die. He's not going to be killed by assassins. He's not going to be killed by Wish, I don't think. Pretty much nothing is taking him out of the game. Now, those things aren't big concerns. It's rare that you would run into some weird problem that kills off your pretender, but with the Demi Lich, it just won't happen. And because he starts at 3 death, and the way that path cost works is that the more points you have added to your magic path, for each additional point you add, it costs more. Now, if you start at 3 points, that means that when you add that 4th point, that's going to cost like, I think, like 10, right? I think it costs as much as adding the first point on a mage pretender, right? So like boosting a path from 0 to 7 for someone who starts with 0 costs the same as boosting from 3 to 10 for someone who starts at 3 in a magic path, right? And since each successive point costs more than the last, those last 3 points, right, the 8th, 9th, and 10th point to get to 10, you're not paying for those. You're only paying for the 5th, 6th, and 7th, and you still get to 10 points. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. And of course, you're actually only paying 8 death, so this is actually relatively cheap because of the pretenders that you have access to. Master Lich, I should note, of course, is more expensive than Demi Lich. However, it's the same deal as with the Demi Lich, except he's pretty hard to kill anyway, and he's still immortal, and he's mobile. And mobile adds a huge amount of benefit to him. There are really good evocations in high death. There are a lot of really good battlefield spells, actually, in high death magic. So you can take that Master Lich, and you can run him at enemy armies over and over again, and he'll be pretty effective at dealing damage. He's really good as a leader, like a battlefield mage for your army. He's really good at going solo against armies and doing stuff like spamming bone grinding to cripple enemy armies before they get to you. Just very, very good utility. One of the best mobile pretenders you can take, right? Mostly because you just can't take him out. He can't be taken out of the game permanently with how immortality works now, so. All right. Fear. Fear is really good. Fear is really... So, it's really expensive, and I don't like basically any of the 10-point blesses for this reason, right? 10 points is kind of too deep to go. With death, it's like almost, maybe it's worth it because of how easy it is to go 10 deep in death if you have access to the Demi Lich in particular, and because of how useful death is to actually have on your pretender to use in battlefield magic and other things. Fear is also extremely powerful. It's super good, right? What it does is it damages the enemy's morale turn after turn, and when it gets low enough, they're going to eventually just fail a morale check and rept, right? And while they're running away, you can just butcher them. So it's insanely good. And this is, it's a Fear Aura 5, right? Do Fear Aura stack? Shit, you know, now after my mistake on Heat and Cold Auras, I don't know. I don't want to say, like, they don't stack. I think, though... Shit. Fear Auras for multiple Fear unit stack. Well, I don't remember if Fear Auras was for multiple Fear unit stack. If you search the manual, for the game manual for Fear, the answer is probably in there. It was for Heat Auras. That said, I'm not sure it matters. This is really good. It's quite possibly worth 10 points, particularly on units that can close to the enemy lines very quickly and that can survive there for a while, because it takes time to take effect. So you either need a ton of units so they can't all be killed off too quickly, or you need very elite units, and they should be fast, right, ideally. Or you want to be able to have some way to get them into combat quickly. For example, I think potentially mixing this with some other defensive buff could be really good on Mictlan's Eagle Warriors, maybe. Let's see. I don't know. I'm not sure what sacreds I would use this on, actually. Not off the top of my head. I didn't really think about this one in advance, but it's very good. It's just very good. You want it to be on frontline infantry. For obvious reasons, putting it on archers or something would be totally useless. It's not going to help your mages. It might help your thugs quite a bit if you don't have access to it. Although I think for thugs, you can craft the Helm of Horrors, which is an item that gives you the same effect with just 2 death. So it loses a little bit of its awesomeness on thugs. What's really awesome is being able to coat the battlefield in units that are going to erode the morale of the enemy's army, right? That's where it's really effective. So nations that have massable sacreds, or nations that have super elite sacreds that are going to be able to survive really well against a horde of enemies, that's where this is going to come in handy. And I think there are a lot of cases where this is actually going to be usable, like surprising number perhaps. One place where this is not perhaps the best choice is if your sacreds really need like 1 or 2 durability blesses to be good. This is probably a bad idea. For example, I don't think Fear would go well with Kalos' Sacreds because they really need something to buff up their protection, and then depending on which protection choice you take, well, Stygian Flesh would negate the option of Fear, and Bark Skin would pretty much necessitate, not only necessitate, but it'd be a very good idea to put points into Fire as well. And I'm not sure you want to invest the points to go Death 10, as well as, what is this, Nature 6 and Fire 4, right? Could be a little rough for you. So this is all perhaps yeah, I think it's kind of the case where if you want a standalone bless, Fear is a pretty good option on units that already have decent armor and that have some sort of like utility that makes them good at getting in with the enemy, either because you have a ton of them to just cover the whole battlefield, your entire front line is these Fear units, or because they have flight or they're fairly fast moving or something, right? That's where these are going to be really good. Although I will say one caveat is that Fear is exceptionally good when paired with Awe. So if you want a really heavy bless, maybe on a dormant bless pretender, Fear plus Fire 7 for Awe could be pretty good. And actually, if you do want to heavy bless and like really nuke your scales as Kaelasa, Fear is very powerful on them. I just think you are going to have a hard time affording it because of course, to attack through Awe, you have to make a morale check, and as your morale is damaged by Fear, you will be less and less likely to succeed on that morale check. Alright, thank you very much for watching. As always, I appreciate comments, either on what you like to see next, or even mistakes I've made, so I can make a correction in future videos. It's always good to hear from you guys. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you next time.